7 after 5. Now, Australia is, of course, one of the great countries to live in on planet Earth. I mean, if you could come here or just look upon the planet and say, where am I going to live? You know, I can choose any country. We'd have to be near the top of the list, if not the top of the list. Now, a survey has come out today ranking countries not just by are they great places to live, but how generous they are. What proportion of people donate money and how much they donate. Now, Australia used to be number one. I think it was 10 years ago. We've slid to number 4, but it's still pretty good. Now, I'm going to speak more about this in a moment, 96900 693 13 13 32. But I've always thought Australians are very generous when it comes to, putting our own hands into our pockets, certainly after natural disasters like, bushfires, or I remember the terrible tsunami back in 2005, I think it was. We donated millions upon millions of dollars to people in need. I do think there's a problem with there being too many charities in Australia. And I know that on average we give roughly the same amount each year. So every time a new charity comes along, it actually subtracts money from existing charities. And sometimes I wonder whether, there's too many charities all trying to do the same thing. But leaving that to one side, if you look at the top 10 countries in terms of generosity, America is number 1, which might surprise some people, but America has, relatively speaking, lower taxes than Australia. Here's the outlier. Number 2 is Myanmar, used to be known as Burma, ruled by a military junta. They're the second most generous country per capita on earth. Number 3 is New Zealand. Number 4 is us, Australia. Number 5, Ireland. Number 6, Canada. Number 7, the UK. Number 8, the Netherlands. Number 9, Sri Lanka. Number 10, Indonesia. So you've got basically 6 English-speaking countries out of the top 10 in terms of generosity, which is something to be proud of. Our next guest is the CEO of Good to Give, Lisa Grinham. Good afternoon.
Hi, Tom. Nice to join you this afternoon.
Well, thank you for joining us. Is it generally accepted that Australia is a generous country?
Look, you're absolutely right in terms of Australians are incredibly generous, particularly when we face a natural disaster. And, we saw the tragedy, which was the bushfires, which happened in, many parts of the country through late 2019 into 2020. And research actually indicates that 1 in 2 people actually gave to support the bushfires. And we've certainly, had a history of that over the years. But where we do tend to fall down, and you hit the nail on the head in terms of saying, we're roughly giving the same amount year on year. And if you actually look at the percent of Australians who claimed a tax deduction, the Australian Taxation Office stats, the latest ones are from 2018, 31% of Australians claimed a tax deduction, and that figure's actually been sliding down since 2012, which is certainly not the trend that we want to see. Okay,
yeah, because these stats out today say that over the past 10 years we've slipped from number 1, that was back in 2010, to number 4, and the figures are based on these figures are based on 2019. All right, so now tell me, with tax deductions, do most countries, at least in the Western world, give you a tax deduction if you donate?
Yeah, they do, and again, it's we're not always comparing apples to apples. And your point around, the US being far more generous, you're absolutely right. I mean, if we look at total giving as a percent of GDP, the US sits at about 2%. Canada and the UK sit at about 1%, and we're actually sitting sort of below that. We're less than 1%. But look, Australia's got a pretty favourable tax environment when it comes to donations. But one of the big differences, for example, in the US is that they have death taxes.
Yes.
So death taxes are a great incentive to give that money away to charities, rather than giving it away in taxes that then potentially go to the government.
Well, that's right. So I mean, you get towards the end of your life and you think, I can either hand this over to the Internal Revenue Service, or I can give it to charities that really matter to me. Yeah, easy decision. Do you agree with me that there's probably too many charities? Like, I can't tell you the number of, say, mental health charities that have popped up in the past few years, and many of them, particularly ones aimed at men, seem to have the same goals, but they've all got their own fundraising teams, they've all got a slightly different way of promoting themselves and so forth. Would we benefit from somehow reducing the number of charities, do you think?
Look, it's a very controversial topic and many, many different points of view. Look, one of the reasons it's great to have many different charities is that often you get really small grassroots organisations that are working in communities, and they really, really understand what the needs are of those communities. You can look at sort of, say, medical research, and you might say, well, actually, maybe we would be better to put all of our resources into a handful of charities that were actually doing research into cancer. So look, it's one of those kind of six and one and half a dozen of the others. There's lots of good arguments as to why we need a broad range of charities, working across a whole lot of different areas and different nuances. But then there is certainly some argument for saying that we need to reduce the number that are there and reduce some of the duplication. So, but I think it's a tricky area.
Yeah, it is, because, trying to tell charities that they have to be wound up or merged with others wouldn't go down well. Hey, it was interesting looking at down the list to countries that on average are less charitable. Palestine, 124, probably no surprises there. Yemen, 126. China, which is communist, has come in at 128. Is that because under a communist system, do you reckon there is no need to give to charity because the state does everything for its people?
Look, I think certainly there's an aspect to that, and again, that's one of the key differences between Australia and, say, the US, because in Australia we've got a fairly strong welfare safety net in Australia, and they don't have that in the US, and so therefore, a lot of people are actually giving to support those people in need, and certainly through COVID, it's been really interesting. So, Good to Give is part of a global organisation. And we have sort of tap into different organisations doing similar work we do in the US, the UK, Russia, Turkey, Bulgaria, South Africa, Brazil and India. So it's been very, very fascinating through the COVID period to see how governments are actually responding to the pandemic. And those countries where the governments are not necessarily, stepping up to the plate, and you see what we had in Australia around, JobKeeper and all sorts of things. And plus, obviously, as you said at the outset, we're a great country to live in, and we've got, very, very little community transmission of the virus. But those countries where they've really, really been suffering, the outpouring of generosity has just been extraordinary.
Well, I was going to ask you about COVID, though, but has COVID, and it did have a pretty significant impact on a lot of people's incomes last year. I know we may not have all those figures yet, but do you think charitable donations dropped away last year because people feared for their financial future?
Look, certainly, I think it's a bit of a twofold, and we haven't got the figures to actually, make any, strong sort of statements. But, we came out of the bushfires when, as I said, they believed that 1 in 2 people actually go to the bushfires. So then you came into a period of COVID, and there would have already been a bit of donor fatigue anyway because people have been so generous. Yeah. And then, as you say, we hit COVID. For a lot of people, they either lost their jobs or they became very unsure of their futures. And so, it may be that they did pull back a little bit in the giving. Certainly, I think some of the wealthy Australians, they stepped up to the plate and they gave more. We work with a lot of big corporate organisations around their workplace giving programs, which is where people, like employees, can make a donation to a charity through our platform. And we actually found that those workplace giving donations held up really strongly because we were tapping into people who were employed, and so they felt very grateful to have a job, and they wanted to continue to support those people who might be in need. And that was the reality. A lot of charities have had more demand on them than ever, so they need those regular donations coming in to support them.
And final question, is it almost an indictment upon governments that we need so many charities? That, could we say that governments are failing to allocate money and resources where they should be allocated, hence the need for charities?
Look, I think there's always going to be a need for government, the not-for-profit sector and business to actually work together to support some of our most vulnerable communities and, and those sort of dynamics and, who's dialing up more at different times depending on different governments and different attitudes towards community support changes. But, look, I think, there would certainly be some areas where you could say, look, government is perhaps failing in this area, so that's where the not-for-profit and businesses that are supporting and individuals that are supporting those charities come in and try to bridge that gap.
All right, thank you for your time. Lisa Grinham there, CEO of Good to Give.